tonight's talk.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation, Benny, and thank you very much for all of you coming on an evening like this. You're all about to be heavily infected from coronavirus, so thank you very much for your courage. It's a great pleasure to be talking on this subject to people who are genuinely curious, because it's, in my estimation, probably the most important topic that we're faced with in the world at the moment, which is how are we going to feed our planet? We know that we have 7.5 billion on the planet today. We will be having 10 billion in a few decades from here. Agriculture is a long cycle investment item. So if we want to feed the people in 10, 20, 30 years from now, we have to invest in these capacities today. If we don't do that, people will starve. This is not about, oh, do I take a plane or not? Do I drive an electric car or not? And things like that. You know, this is very fundamental. If we do not grow enough food in the world, people do not have enough to eat. And if people do not have enough to eat, you cannot have a civil society. You cannot create peace. You cannot create prosperity with people who do not have enough to eat. So that is my thesis on why this is fundamentally important. In the course of this discussion, I will be going through a lot of scientific material. And I'm going to have to ask you to be patient with that material, because I think it is important that we look at the primary evidence. And I will try as best as I can to explain that primary evidence. And if you still have questions, then please ask me afterwards, and we'll have more of a debate. But it's really important that we do not get stuck on opinion versus opinion. Here's my favorite scientist, and here's your favorite scientist, and then it's just like, let's really look at the primary evidence and what is going on in this debate. And since all of this is a very fundamentally important questions, I do think that we all have the responsibility to try to understand this as much as we can. This is not something that we can delegate to others and say, I'll let them work it out. I think we do need to understand it. So before I go into the presentation, I do want to say one more thing. I'm a trained financial economist. Okay, so I used to be a banker, and I was trading financial instruments, and then I got a PhD in financial economics. And I've been teaching economics at university and so on. So I'm not a climate scientist, okay? I do not pretend, and I will never claim, that I'm capable of creating primary evidence myself. I'm not a trained atmospherics physicist. I can't do that. But I can read scientific papers. That I'm capable of. And so what I'm presenting to you is really in the style of a reporter. That I report to you what I found in the course of my curiosity and research about how does agriculture contribute to climate change, or does it at all? All right? So, let's go into the subject matter. This is my thesis, all right? Animal proteins save our world. Meat, eggs, milk. I'll come back to that at the end. We need animal proteins to feed our population. We need to feed our population in order to have civil societies. And this is only possible with these things. Okay? Vegetarianism is a luxury good for rich people in rich countries. Everybody else, which is the vast majority on this planet, cannot afford to do without these. What can we all agree on with regard to climate change? So if we look at CO2, carbon dioxide levels over the last 800,000 years. Yeah? So 800,000 years to today. We see a fluctuation of those levels roughly between 200 and 300 ppm in the atmosphere. And we see that since the Industrial Revolution, that thing has been exploding to where it's now 400. All right? So clearly, something is different from the last 800,000 years. Yeah? There is no debating that point. That's primary evidence. We know that the atmosphere has way more CO2 ppm stored than it would have under natural conditions. And it's fairly obvious that the Industrial Revolution, with all its burning of fossil fuels, is responsible for putting that CO2 into the atmosphere. Right? So I think that we can all agree on primary evidence, check that. The second thing that we can all agree on is, this is the same picture for methane. Now methane is that famous gas which the cows are emitting, okay? And same thing, over the 800,000 years, we had a typical concentration level of parts per billion. This is not ppm, ppb, fluctuating between 500 and 700 ppb. And since the Industrial Revolution, we've got triple of that in the atmosphere. So we're now at roughly 1800 ppb. Yeah? So we're triple the level of methane in the atmosphere compared to, sort of many years ago. So this also, primary evidence, very well secured. You can argue, how do we know how much methane we had 600,000 years? Well, we know that from ice core drillings where we have atmosphere conserved. So that's really, I have no reason, I don't know anybody else who has reason to doubt that that is the reality. We have triple the levels of methane in the atmosphere, okay? Now, the third thing that we can agree on is that we are experiencing global warming. So I live in the Alps. Glaciers are melting. Yeah. So there's global warming around, temperatures are rising, in some places temperatures are cooling, whatever, but overall, if we look here at this green and blue bar from 1970 to 2020, we see that temperatures are rising. This is this is the trend per decade. So what this says is that currently we have a trend line of about 0.13 degrees per decade of temperature increases. And there is a lot of debate on these things, whether that's due to more temperature sensors and so on and so forth, and then people say, no, that's corrected for. There's a whole science behind that, but by and large, I think we can pretty much tell that all around the world, glaciers are melting and so on and so forth. Sea temperatures are rising a bit. So we are experiencing some warming, all right? That we can also agree on, or should be able to agree on. What we cannot agree on is that the climate models that the climate scientists work with and do their predictions, and particularly the models approved by the IPCC, the International Panel for Climate Change, their models are currently predicting a current rate of climate change that's about 0.3 degree increase per decade. So this is where the models are and the temperature change. This is where the observations are. Or put in a different way, you could also say the actual observed temperature increases are in these blue lines, but the models are saying it should be here. All right? So there is a big disagreement. The models are roughly predicting 3 times more temperature increase than what we're actually measuring. That's not a particularly new insight. That's been published a lot and so on, and people are trying to explain the discrepancy. But I just want to make the point here. I'm not here to argue that there is no climate change. There is climate change. What the reasons are for climate change, we can also have another debate. And I'm not even qualified to really judge that. But what I do want to say, according to all my research and my reporting, cows are not the reason, okay? Cows are not the reason for whatever climate change we have. And I will explain to you why and how. So, if these are the things that we can agree on, I want to make it still a little bit of a detour in the CO2 debate. And I'll explain to you later why that is necessary. So here's a chart, again, over the last 800,000 years. In the bottom, we see temperature differences, as measured, again, by ice cores. And at the top, we see concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere. And the remarkable thing about these graphs is that they map 1 to 1. You know, the correlation is basically 1. So when temperatures went up 120,000 years ago, CO2 in the atmosphere was also up. And when temperatures went down, CO2 went down. Okay? So this maps 1 to 1. Temperatures are up, CO2 is up. If temperature is down, CO2 is down. Very clear correlation over the last 800,000 years. Now, the problem here is, of course, it's correlation. It's not clear what's cause. Yeah? You know that famous story that there is a statistic, 100% proof, that eating ice cream causes drowning. Yeah? Because there's a one-to-one relationship between people eating ice cream in summer and drowning in summer. So clearly, eating ice cream must lead to drowning, right? So we have many of these examples that correlation is not necessarily causation. But clearly, there's something that is related to each other here. Now, what could that be? Very basic one-on-one, very basic climate change. So here is a model of the world. This is the Pacific Ocean. It's a picture from 27th of January 2012. This is a picture of the top of the atmosphere. So that's not ground level, top of the atmosphere. And I would like you to observe this cloud here. This is Papua New Guinea. And there is a cloud here covering basically from PNG all the way to Hawaii. And so this cloud shows up as receiving a lot of heat from the sun. Yeah? So it's receiving around 800 watts per square meter of heat. That's because the cloud is there. Now, in other parts of the atmosphere, where on that particular day we didn't have any clouds, please take a seat. Where we didn't have any clouds, the top of the atmosphere could not be receiving any temperature because there was nothing to receive. You know, it was a transparent atmosphere. So the heat waves went all the way down to the surface. So that explains this picture. So you see that if there's a cloud, it receives all the heat. If there's no cloud, the heat goes to the surface of the planet. Now, this is incoming heat, and that is short wave. And now this heat is, these heat waves are reaching the planet, and from there they're being reflected again. Now, they're being reflected. This is the same part of the planet on the same day. And here you see the blue bars. This is the heat that is emitted from the Earth back into the atmosphere. Yeah, this is measuring the Earth with a satellite from outside. And so you see here the same cloud, And where we have that cloud, the emission is only about 60 watts per square meter, because obviously the heat is reflected from the surface and is trapped by the cloud, so the cloud cannot emit it into the atmosphere. But where we don't have any clouds, so this was a cloud-free area, where we have no clouds, the heat emission is actually in the area of 300 watts per square meter. Yeah? So this is essentially what's going on when we talk about the climate of the planet. The Earth receives sunshine, and the surface reflects that back into the atmosphere, and we can measure where all this emission is going back into the atmosphere. So we have these satellite pictures that tell us how much heat is going back into space. Now, to make this a little bit more complicated, so these long waves, okay, these long waves can be differentiated into different frequency length. So this is radiation frequency, the unit is centimeters, so at 500 centimeters, 1000 centimeters, 1500 radiation frequency. So you know that light and infrared as well splits up into different frequencies. And these frequencies actually remit different amount of strength, of heat strength back into outer space. This is what we're measuring here on the y-axis. Yeah? So this is the amount of watt per square meter that is being emitted back into outer space. Now the blue line here, the blue line says if there was no atmosphere, like planet Mars, if there was no atmosphere, then at the frequency of 500 centimeters, there would be 400 watt per square meter being emitted into outer space. So you see that per frequency, this is actually different. It's at zero, at no frequencies, there's zero, obviously, then it goes up and goes back down again. Yeah? Again, this is all primary evidence. We know that it's not contested by anybody. Now, we have an atmosphere. We're not planet Mars. So we have an atmosphere, and therefore the black line says the difference between the black line and the blue line is the amount of heat that does not get emitted out into outer space because it is retained by the atmosphere. So the difference between black and blue is the greenhouse gas effect. And that greenhouse gas effect totals up to about 33 degrees. Our actual average temperature on the planet is 16 degrees plus. And if we didn't have that greenhouse effect, it would be minus 17 degrees minus. Right? So the difference is 33 degrees. And the difference is here between the black line and the blue line. Now, most of that black line is water vapor. Water vapor in the atmosphere or clouds at different levels. The vast majority of the greenhouse gas is actually water. That creates most of the greenhouse gas effect. But there is one prominent exception, and that's this thing here. So look here, at about 600 centimeters radiation frequency, we have CO2, carbon dioxide. And this carbon dioxide likes to trap this frequency. Yeah, so when there's a frequency of 600 centimeters hitting a CO2 molecule, it gets excited, physically excited, and by this physical excitement traps energy, and that energy is then stored in the atmosphere instead of being emitted into outer space. And that mechanism is so effective that almost all the energy in that bandwidth is captured by the CO2, okay? So the natural levels of CO2 play a significant role in our overall climate change, greenhouse gas thing. This is when we're talking about CO2 being a greenhouse gas, this is what we're talking about. In that bandwidth of infrared frequencies, CO2 traps heat rather than emitting it into outer space, keeps it in the atmosphere, warms the atmosphere up. All right? So, we have a similar one here in methane. Methane also likes to trap heat at 1,300 centimeters. We'll come back to that in a moment. Now, if we had no CO2, this is the green line here. If there was no CO2 in the atmosphere, then this would be the water vapor's job of retaining energy between the green line and the blue line. If we have 400 ppm, which is what we currently have, 400 ppm, then the line is that. Now let's say we would double. Remember, the historical evidence, the historical experience was between 200 and 300 over the last 800,000 years. Now we're at 400, and that creates that black line. If we would double that again to 800 ppm, then that would be the red line. It's virtually no difference. Yeah? The only little bit difference is here on the shoulders, where the additional CO2 would capture a few more heat waves that are otherwise not captured. So the argument, and this is Professor Weingarten from York University in Canada, he says, if we continue our current industrial policy like we've done for the last 50 years, we will be at 800 ppm in the year 2200. Yeah? And then that difference here will roughly make 1 degree of global warming. So if we continue as we did so far, we will move 1 degree hotter in the year 2200. Now, why is this relevant? And in a way, you don't need to have a PhD in atmospheric physics. Why does increasing CO2 concentration in the atmosphere not increase the amount of temperature? And it's really very simple. You have a column of 50 kilometers of atmosphere, and there's CO2 spread throughout that. And once that column is saturated with CO2, then there is really no heat wave that can be sort of, once every heat wave has been trapped by one CO2 molecule, it doesn't matter if you put more CO2 into it, there is no more heat. There is still heat in other regions, but that heat in the other regions do not get trapped by CO2. So the saturation level of CO2 can be measured, and it looks something like this. So in the tropopause, this is the red line here, CO2, and at the top of the atmosphere it's here. If I have no, so 1 is our current level, if I have no CO2, then if I add a little bit CO2, the heat trapping grows exponentially. But then I reach a saturation level where an additional piece of CO2 does not create more heat trapping, because all the heat that is possible to be trapped is already trapped. Now I can, the red bar goes a little bit up, so if I add a little bit more, I gather a little bit more stray heat there, but the saturation is basically that thing. There's not much more you can do, all right? And here the CH4, the methane, is the black line, is the same thing. The saturation levels in the atmosphere are so high that adding additional of these gases will not create a corresponding effect of warming. This is the same, a little bit mathematically said. If I take all my climate gases, so water, CO2, ozone, methane, and nitrogen oxide, and I would say, in my current atmosphere, how much heat are they trapping? They're trapping 150 watts per square meter. That's my current atmosphere. If I would do half of that, of my current atmosphere, I would have, out of the 150 watts, if I would have half the amount of CO2, that's this thing here, I would reduce the heat impact by 5 watts per square meter, out of a total of 150. So half means I go from current 400 back to 200. 200 is at the height of an ice age. Yeah. So if I save all the CO2 and I go back to the levels of the ice age, which is 200, then I would reduce the climate impact by 5 watt per square meters. So I can, it's a little bit simplified, but basically it's linear. If I divide this by that, that's 3%, okay? 3% of the 33 degrees that I just mentioned, of the overall climate greenhouse gas effect. So I would get 1 degree of climate change. I would get 1 degree reduction in climate impact. This is actually arithmetics. So I don't, again, this is actually fairly simple algebra, that this carbon dioxide levels cannot be in charge of that climate change. Now, I need to go back a few, here. The differences between 200 and 300 ppm, remember I said before it's a one-to-one relationship, but what's the causality? Between 200 and 300 ppm difference caused 10 to 12 degrees of global temperature. Cause is actually the wrong word, is related to 10 to 12 degrees. But I just told you that if I go in the impact that CO2 can have, it can only be 1 degree. So clearly, the CO2 alone cannot account for the differences that we see. There must be other mechanisms going on. Other mechanisms that create this big of a correlation between these two. The direct greenhouse gas effect, the direct greenhouse gas effect cannot be the reason. Now, of course, the climate science people at the IPCC are not stupid, all right? These numbers are, by the way, not contested. So even hardcore IPCC scientists will agree with these numbers. They're published by authors and so on. What IPCC scientists will typically say, yeah, but if I have more CO2, so let's say the other direction, if I double CO2, from 400 to 800, there is a principle called water vapor relationship. So the relationship of the amount of CO2 and the amount of water vapor is fixed. So if I put more CO2 in the atmosphere, I increase the amount of water vapor. Yeah? And if I have more water vapor, I get this entire effect here, the black line. So, and also water vapor is not as saturated. You know, if I put more water vapor, that's the blue line. If I put more water vapor in the atmosphere, I get additional climate effects here. So what the IPCC scientists are saying is, more CO2 has a small effect, but it has a big indirect effect because it increases the amount of water vapor in the atmosphere, and the water vapor will then cause the climate change. Yeah? And that explains then this difference. Because the models are assuming the more CO2 I put in the atmosphere, the more water vapor I get, and the higher the temperature should go. There's two big problems with that theory. The one problem is it just simply does not agree with the primary evidence. You know, the primary evidence, the planet just refuses to heat up as much as the models are saying. So there is just no primary evidence for that model. There, the IPCC says, oh, no problem. It's just, that's a temporary issue. You know, it will come back. So don't worry. On the precautionary principle, we should err on the side of caution, and therefore we should assume that the relationship principle holds, and this thing will eventually, you know, this curve will catch up with our models. We've been having this debate among climate scientists for the last 30 years. All of what I'm telling you is actually not particularly new. It's been going on for a long time, and it cannot be settled. It cannot be settled because what we would need is direct observation in the atmosphere. We would need direct observation of what's happening in the 80 kilometers worth of the atmosphere. Now, we had an instrument on a satellite called Nimbus satellites in the 70s. That satellite did observations. These observations ended up being in punch card format at NASA, and that's where they're still today. Most of the data of the Nimbus satellites have not been analyzed until the very day. We're starting to lose the machines to be actually able to read the punch cards. Then we got new satellite missions called CERES, and they were starting to measure these things too, only that the instruments were not calibrated properly. So the measurements are basically not valid because we have to kind of, you know, put them into a circular logic to create reasonable data out of them. So that data is also useless. We were supposed to put in a new satellite next year that was going to finally solve that problem. And if it had started measuring then for the next 20 years, we would start to get good data on what's happening in the atmosphere. That satellite has been recently canceled by the Trump administration. So we will continue not to have any primary data on what is going on with the water vapor in the atmosphere. And in the absence of primary data, we can continue until the horses grow horns. Right? So that debate is pretty old, and yeah, you can take it either way. We just don't have primary evidence. Now I'm coming back to milk. FAO, into the year 2006, introduced an interesting game changer into this debate. We've been having climate change debate since the late 80s. The first climate conference was 1973. And really, it didn't really interest very many people. You know, some politics didn't care about it and so on. It started to change with these two publications. When Mr. Steinfeld from the FAO said in 2006, all livestock in the world produces 18% of global greenhouse emissions. Whoa, nobody has thought about this before. Cows, sheep, camels, but particularly cows, 18% of global greenhouse gases. Wow. Then year 2013, Mr. Steinfeld published, kind of redid the numbers and came out it was 14.5%. So since then, this 15% is basically fixed. You will find this coming up all over the time. And why is this such a game changer? These two publications now allowed a convergence of a vegan-oriented animal rights movement and climate change. Now, suddenly, eating animals was not only ethically a problem, you were also starting to damage the climate. And that was a game changer to this entire greenhouse gas, CO2, climate change debate. Because now suddenly everybody was eating meat, which is basically everybody, became a sinner. Every time you eat meat, you are ruining the climate. There is a much deeper emotional connection about the food you eat and being a sinner, rather than a machine you use. The depth of ethical sin is not as bad as you use a machine. You know, we all know that machines are bad. You know, that cars, planes, that is, you know, unnatural. We know that. But that your food, that the food you're eating, that with that you're ruining the planet, that creates a much deeper sin. And now suddenly, the entire climate change debate created the emotional hook that it was lacking before. Who really cared in the 90s about climate change? Nobody. Today, everybody seems to be caring. And it's because of that link. That link is politically necessary for climate change debate to be politically relevant. Yeah? So this is what that created. Unfortunately, the science behind it is not even shaky. It basically doesn't even exist. And I'm going to give you a glimpse of why that is the case. After these reports came out, there was a lot of bahuha and, you know, what's actually going on, and there was lots of conflicting reports and numbers, nothing fit to each other. So the IPCC said, we'll put together a committee and study this once and for all, land utilization and climate change. How does land utilization, including all agriculture, including, of course, livestock, how does that impact climate change? Now, that report came out on 8th of August 2019. Yeah? 8th of August 2019, they said, we present that report. Huge press reception all over the world. So Washington Post said, changing climate imperils global food, water supplies, new UN study finds, and put a picture of cows on the front page. Nature, scientific journal Nature says, eat less meat. UN climate change report calls for change to human diet. Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung said, der Klimastachel im Fleisch. Now, I actually read that report. The funny thing is, it doesn't say. That report simply does not say that. There's not a single word in that report that says eat less meat. On the contrary, in that report, in the summary for policymakers, it says animal source food produced in resilient, sustainable, low GHG emission systems present major opportunities for adaptation and mitigation of climate change effects, while generating significant co-benefits in terms of human health. So in the summary of that report, in the conclusion of the report says meat is important. Animal-sourced proteins is important for feeding our planet, and if we do it right, it's actually sustainable. That's what the report says. So where does the media get all these headlines from? Not from that report. Okay? There's more. So the Guardian, Mr. Monbiot, he actually acknowledges that. He said, we cannot keep eating as we are. Why isn't the IPCC shouting this from the rooftops? That was his comment on 9th of August. And then he says, in its crucial land and climate report, the IPCC irresponsibly understates the true carbon cost of our meat and dairy habits. So I ask you, where does Mr. Monbiot knows that from if the scientists don't know that? The scientists, the IPCC, just put together a 3-year effort, 20,000 scientists, and they produced that report. The report doesn't say it, but Mr. Monbiot knows it. I'm telling you that story in order to show the link and the distance, the link in the policy-making circle and the distance that that policy debate has taken from science. Scientists are simply not saying what media and policy circles are claiming that scientists are saying. And here we actually have it black on white. Everybody can download that report and read it for themselves. Right? Now, on cows. This is a satellite picture from the year 2003 to 2005. It shows methane concentrations in the atmosphere. The methane is not equally distributed. So blue is low concentrations, red is high concentrations. Okay? So you can see clearly China, industrialized China, huge amount of methane concentration. You can also see India has here relatively high concentrations, Europe, but you can also see the leaking gas pipelines of Russia. Yeah. Very high methane concentrations in Russia, all along the pipelines. Now here in the lower map, you have all the livestock methane emissions. All the famous countries that have lots of livestock, Brazil and Argentina. Now look at where all the livestock is and try to find the methane in the atmosphere. Yeah? Or look at Ethiopia and Sudan. Most people do not know that these two countries have more cows than all of Europe together. There is more cows in Ethiopia and Sudan than in all of Europe. Now, there's all these cows here, but it's green. No heightened methane concentration. Australia and New Zealand, very heavy cattle concentrations, no methane in the atmosphere. There is no correlation between livestock concentrations and methane concentrations. You will not find a correlation in the atmosphere. So that's one of the pieces of evidence why people like me and others are saying the methane emissions of the cow cannot be the reason why we have methane concentrations in the atmosphere. Because otherwise we would have to see a more direct relationship here. Something else must be going on. Now, some people are saying I would be denying that cows emit methane. That's nonsense. Of course, cows emit methane. That's what they do. That's how they live and breathe, and they emit methane, by the way, through the mouth. Yeah. So it's not that cows do not emit methane. The issue is whatever they are emitting, it does not seem to be ending up in the atmosphere. So where is it going? Now here is Professor Rob Jackson of Stanford University. Now Rob Jackson is as mainstream IPCC as they come. He's hardcore IPCC. This is not so-called climate skeptic or so. This is somebody who is really in the mainstream of IPCC. So he gathered this Methane Global Balance project in the year 2016. And this is his quote. Unlike carbon dioxide, where we have well-described power plants, almost everything in the global methane budget is diffuse. From cows to wetlands to rice paddies, the methane cycle is harder. Says the methane authority in the world. We do not understand what's going on in the methane cycle in atmosphere. Says him, not me. Okay? Now, let's look at this methane budget a little bit more deeper. This is Rob Jackson's methane budget, yeah? He says we're generating each year about 560 teragrams of methane. This is what we're emitting into the atmosphere each year, 560. And 550 of that is being destroyed in the atmosphere again, for an annual net gain of 10. Okay, so each year, the amount of methane in the atmosphere is increasing by 10 teragrams. The total stock right now is almost 5,000 teragrams in the atmosphere, and it's increasing by 10. Now, the only number out of these three that we know for certain is that 10. Okay? Because we know how much methane is in the atmosphere, and so we can calculate that back of the net retainment in the atmosphere of 10 teragram per year. Here we have some estimates of what are all the different sources, and these estimates come out to about 558, 560. So by algebra, we know that the difference of what gets destroyed in the atmosphere must be 550. Yeah? This thing we have no idea about. We just don't know. I'll show you in a moment about. This thing we know for sure. This thing, we have some pretty good estimates. All right? This is the methane balance that we have. Now, Rob Jackson says some of these are natural. So natural emissions, termites, oceans, permafrost, and so on. Wetlands, so all of this is natural emissions of methane, amounting to about 220. And then we have biomass burning. He says that's kind of a mixture between human-caused and natural. And then we have agriculture and waste. That's an interesting category. Yeah? He says he groups agriculture and waste into one category. All right? And then we have fossil fuel production and use. So these would be human cost. And so he's saying, okay, all of that is responsible for climate change, and that not. Okay? Because that's natural and that's human-made. Now, this chart really deserves a lot of investigation. Let's say, okay, this is human cost, and the natural rate would be 220. Yeah? Before the Industrial Revolution. And the sink of what gets destroyed in the atmosphere is 550. So apparently the sink mechanisms have doubled over the natural rate. Yeah? Because if we're able to destroy 550, where the natural rate was only 220, then apparently we have not only created more methane emissions, we have also increased the capacity of the atmosphere to destroy that methane. So why doesn't the atmosphere just simply destroy that as well? The atmosphere has apparently been able to increase its capacity to destroy methane by 250 teragrams per year. Why doesn't the atmosphere just do 260? And then that problem would be gone. Yeah. The other thing here is what is being totally ignored. All the cows, the entire cows that we have on the planet today, are assumed to be human-caused. Now, we had ruminants before the Industrial Revolution. In the year 1900, we actually had more cows in the United States than we have today. And in the year 1700, we had more bisons and elks than we have cows today. And these bisons and elks were also emitting methane. We think that in the year 1500, in all of Africa, we had 26 million elephants. Today, there's 100,000 left. That's a different problem. But those 26 million elephants, they emitted the same amount of methane than the entire dairy cow herd of Europe today. So there had been animals before, wild animals. And if you kind of calculate it through, very probably the herd that was out there before humans was the same size as the herd as we have today. So this is not human caused, this was there before. Only now it's domesticated animals, before it was wild animals. Coming back to this 10, this is a very clear indication that there's something that we do not understand. Yeah. Because we have no idea what's going on here. A simplified model of what's going on is we start with the CH4, we mix it with OH, and it becomes CH3 and HO2 and CH2 and CH3 and blah, 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 and it becomes CO2, okay? The simplified model in the laboratory. Now, all of that is happening up there 30 kilometers in the atmosphere where we have no measuring stations. So that's why we have no idea what's actually happening in the atmosphere, because we can't measure it. Nobody's living up there. Dr. Kreischke is another hardcore IPCC scientist. He says the photochemical sink of CH4 is large and difficult to quantify given the very short lifetime of OH. OH is this thing here. So without OH, CH4 does not get erased. The lifetime is less than 1 second. Yeah, no wonder we can't measure it. We don't live up there and we can't measure it. So we just don't know how this sink operates. We're simply staring blank. All right? What we do know is, and it's the same chart for methane that I showed you for CO2 before. Same chart, black line would be our current level, and if we double that, it would be the red line. No impact. Yeah, we can be putting so many cows on this planet as we like. It's not going to have any impact on further greenhouse gases. I'll skip over this thing because it's actually a little bit diversion. Yeah, so that's why I'm skipping that part here. I have here a few final charts. That thing should look familiar? It's London. Yeah. So River Thames. We are right here now. That's where we are. The city of London. So this is a Google Maps picture of London. And I parked there a giant drop of milk over here at St. James Park. Yeah, I painted it in here. This is a ball, a giant drop of milk. I just want to ask you, I've been talking a lot, so now you can guess a little bit. What does this drop of milk represent? Is that the annual consumption of milk of Europe, of the UK, of England, of London, God forbid, of Ireland? So what does that represent, that drop of milk that I just... A sphere. Yes. It's a sphere of actually 1,100 meters diameter. Yeah, it's a sphere of 1,100 meters. So what's the annual consumption that this represents?
Global.
Pardon? Global? Yeah? London? Global and London? Okay, well, actually, it is global, yeah. It is the entire global consumption of milk. 700 million metric tons. That's the unit. 700 million metric tons. And that if you fill a globe of 1.1 kilometer diameter, then you get that giant drop. Now, to give you an idea, what that is relative to, I parked here a big water bubble over Canary Wharf. This is the amount of household fresh water use per year in the United Kingdom. Okay? That's about 5 times as much as the global consumption of milk is the water consumption of households in UK. Just to give you a bit of a dimension of what we're talking about. Now, let me ask you, if we accumulated all plastics in the world, the entire annual plastic production, everything, for food containers and construction materials and automotive materials, all plastics, everything that you can think of, how much would that be? How many million metric tons of the entire plastic production in the world? Would that be twice as much as the milk, 10 times as much, half as much, a tenth of that?
10%.
A tenth of, or 10 times of?
10, 100,
about 100, okay? Do you have other guesses? Total plastic production in the world? It's not numbers that you normally deal with, but plastic is in the news a lot, right? Well, it's pretty good. Yeah, it's 350. 350 million metric tons of plastic is the total annual production. So we're producing roughly twice as much milk as plastic. If you take all the plastic together, I parked it here on Waterloo Station. That fits pretty nice on Waterloo Station. Yeah. Now some people are saying, yes, proteins are important, milk proteins important, animal proteins important, but we don't need animals for that. We can produce that in factories, in lab factories and things like that. And it's true, we can. It's basically carbohydrates. Yeah,
Does your milk include cheese and the things that would have been used?
That's going to be turned into, yes.
So that is the total output?
That's the total output of milk produced, and that then becomes other things. Yeah, yeah.
Sorry, the plastic is global or?
Global, yeah. So if we can produce plastics, we can produce milk as well. You just have to put in carbohydrates and amino acids and so on and so forth. So I did some very rough calculations on that, what that would imply. If I take the total size of factories in the world that are producing plastic, did some estimations there, might be wrong, but more or less, if you took all plastic factories in the world, you could kind of cover London with that. Yeah, so it's a 40 by 40 square kilometer. Plastic factories in China and Abu Dhabi and Singapore and a few left here in Europe. Put them all together on one bunch and you get sort of the size of London. If we were to produce all the milk in the world in factories rather than by cows, we would need roughly 2,000 times the fleet of the current plastic factories. Now, to give you an idea what that means, 2,000 times of that size, that would be that. We would basically have to cover all of Western Europe in factories in order to produce the required milk instead by cows in reactors, in chemical reactors. It's technically possible, but we would have to dedicate all of Europe, cover it with factories, and that's only milk. Then comes eggs and meat as well. And why should we do that? Based on zero scientific evidence that methane is actually creating any significant climate change. There is no scientific evidence. There is the flimsiest of evidence and understanding of what's happening, but we do know that we have to get rid of all the cows and start drinking factory milk.
What's your feedstock factory milk then?
That would be simple sugars. But the simple sugars, of course, have to be produced as well.
Grow those.
Yeah.
And is that where you get that nasty area from?
That's not even included in that, because the cheap feedstock, I would assume, you can. So, here we are. That's why I'm saying animal proteins save our world. We will need these things.
Thank you very much. What a tour de force.